All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I just want to first start by saying welcome and thank you all so much for being here. We are going to record this event and hopefully live stream. So I just want to provide consent to anyone in the room so that you're aware. If there's anything else, just be aware of this at the moment. So just a little logistical. I also want to kick off. My name is Ashlyn. I am one of the many amazing representatives of Fashion Revolution USA. And I'm really grateful to be here from Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I want to acknowledge that our community stands on Minnesota Mehoke, the homelands of the Dakota. While we at Fashion Revolution USA are still learning and pushing ourselves to do better to support our Indigenous communities, we're continuing our journey and want to encourage all of you to learn about the importance of land acknowledgements and see where you are currently standing upon. So thank you for the opportunity to share that today. Thank you again. Really looking forward to the conversation around our theme this year of rights, relationships, and revolution. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the microphone to Elizabeth Segran, who is our moderator and our lead for today. But I'll be in the background helping support chat or anything else that you might need along the way. So thank you all, and Liz, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so glad to welcome you to this, what I hope is going to be a really informative and interesting conversation for you. My name is Elizabeth Segran. I am a staff writer at Fast Company magazine, where I write about the fashion industry, and I'm particularly interested in sustainability and labor issues in the fashion industry. I'm also the author of a new book called The Rocket Years: How Your 20s Launch the Rest of Your Life. This is a really interesting conversation to me because it's something that we're dealing with right now. And it's also something that not a lot of us are fully aware about. So in Los Angeles, there are currently more than 45,000 garment workers. Most of them are immigrant women, many are undocumented. And they work in the garment district, and they work for very low wages. They are not paid a minimum wage. And that is because factories skirt the law by paying what is called a piece rate. So rather than paying for the amount of time a person works, they pay per piece. And sometimes they pay as little as 2 to 5 cents per garment that a worker makes. And as a result, there are lots of workers who are earning as little as $5 an hour, working very, very long days. And so, what we need right now is legislation that will stop this from happening. And fortunately, we have a legislative Sorry, I keep getting muted. The Garment Worker Protection Act, which aims to eliminate this piece rate system. So today we are going to be talking about this very important piece of legislation, and more broadly about the state of labor in the United States. I have a really wonderful panel of women. We have the senator, as I've just mentioned. We also have Ayesha Barenblat, the founder and CEO of the organization Remake, who has done a lot of amazing things, including she's launched a campaign called the Pay Up campaign that is asking brands to pay fair wages, particularly during the pandemic, when many of them canceled orders and put all of that, all of those costs onto the workers in the factories. We also have Marissa Nuncio, who is the director of the Garment Worker Center. We have Santos Say Velasquez, who is a garment worker. And we also have Sarah Ditty, who's the policy director at Fashion Revolution. Welcome to all of you, amazing women. I'm so happy to be here with you today. So let's just jump into this conversation. You know, as a writer, you know, I often talk to brands and consumers who think that, you know, it's so awesome. You know, I bought this garment, it's made in the USA. And there's this notion that because products are made here in this country, they are more ethical. And it's really important for us to be educating people about, you know, what's really happening here. So Senator Durazo, would you tell us a little bit what's actually going on here in terms of what it means when a product is made in the USA?
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. And it's so great to see all the women here and the men, but led and organized by women. It's really been wonderful. This campaign for garment workers has strengthened me as a woman. And I hope that all together, we're gonna get what the women who hold up the fashion industry really deserve. So the apparel industry in LA County produces almost $5 billion in output. And it's our garment workers that should be thanked for that. They are highly skilled. They're not, you know, entry level. They are highly skilled. They've been at their jobs for decades, many of them. So these 45,000 men and women, mostly immigrant women are working far too many hours, 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And they're making everything from the designer clothes, jeans, to face masks and personal protective equipment. They were being used to do that, to keep us safe. But at the same time, and I'm sure you'll hear directly from Santos and Marissa, they were not getting even the most minimal protections during the pandemic. No soap, no separation, social distancing, nothing of that. We had two garment shops, large garment shops, where there were hundreds of workers who were who got the coronavirus, and many of them died from it, and there was no attention being paid to the working conditions in this as industry as a whole. So we are working really hard to make sure not only to lift up their voices, but if you're going to call people essential workers, then treat them as essential workers. Do not treat them like they're garbage, like they're dispensable, like their lives don't matter. Don't do that to them and be a hypocrite and turn around and call them essential workers. Live up to what they do, especially in Los Angeles. I think the apparel industry in LA is the largest in the country. They are holding up the fashion industry. And you know, many of their conditions beyond the pandemic are very similar to the sweatshop conditions that Eastern European immigrants faced in the 1900s. And it's shameful for us. And I'm really proud that we have introduced a bill to address that with regards to the piece rate. It is a de facto below minimum wage strategy that's used by many employers. They try to say, well, that's an opportunity for, you know, some of these workers to make so much more based on their skill, which is not true. The workers have no control over what the piece rate is. They're never negotiate what the piece rate is. If they get to do better, many times it's at enormous cost to their bodies and to the health. And then the piece rate is dropped, and there they are trying to, you know, it's a race to the bottom, not a race to the top. So our bill addresses.
So sorry.
Go ahead, I'm sorry. Yeah.
So that's legal, right? I mean, the problem is that the piece rate system is actually legal, and there's just currently no legislative or legal remedy for that. Is that right?
Yes. So we're proposing to eliminate the piece rate and replace it with the opportunity for incentive-based bonuses. So no one should be deprived of being able to do more. But we also don't want a race to the bottom. We're expanding liability to the brands for wage violations, a presumption that the workers' testimony is valuable. It means a lot. It should not be ignored when investigating these claims, and to allow the Labor Commissioner's office to investigate and cite the brand guarantors. So these are demands that came from the workers.
Yeah.
And I'll just end, Elizabeth, by saying the reason I got so personally involved as a legislator, had just gotten elected 3 years ago, and the garment workers came and they testified, because we have a restitution fund that's supposed to address, whenever somebody really doesn't get paid, and but it's become a substitute for employers not paying the minimum wage. So they came to testify that it was years that they had filed the claim, adjudicated the claim, won the claim, and they still were getting paid. And meanwhile, our restitution fund, which is supposed to be used on occasion, became the rule instead of the exception, becoming insolvent. The state then has to pay these wages. So I'm very grateful to have reconnected with my sisters and brothers in the garment industry. Thank you, Elizabeth.
We're so grateful to you for introducing this bill. And I think that what's really exciting for all of us who are here, listening and participating in this conversation, is that we can also play a role here. We can advocate for this. We can talk to other people about what's going on, and we can put pressure on our legislators to move this along. We have a role that we can play here. But I just wanted to ask, so Santos, would you, many people still think that when a product is made in America, workers are treated well, and the quality of the workplace is, it's wonderful, and it's so different from conditions in Asia where things are really bad. Is that true? I mean, what are working conditions like for you here in the United States?
I believe we can welcome Natalia up to
translate.
Natalia.
Hola, Santo.
Hola, ¿cómo está?
Mucho gusto. Yo voy a traducir para usted, ¿ok? Si me deja la oportunidad para poder traducirlo, ¿ok?
Sí,
sí.
Mi nombre es Santos Say
Disculpe,
Velasquez. Ok.
Sí, adelante. Sí, Natalia.
Do we have somebody translating for Santos?
Yes, this is Santo, and he's going to tell us his story now.
Mi nombre es Santos Say Velasquez. Tengo 26 años de trabajo en la costura y tengo 3 años de estar en este grupo de trabajadores, y mi experiencia en la costura es, de verdad, como yo no sabía al principio cuando llegué aquí, pues yo no sabía cómo es fabricar una ropa, nada, no sabía nada, pero cuando yo aprendí aquí, ganaba nomás 200. Al principio ganaba nomás 100 porque como no sabía manejar la máquina, y ahí donde empecé a trabajar en la costura y aprendí muchos trabajos. Pegaba label cerca de 2,000 al día, hago 5 centavos me pagan pegar label. Y para entrar para las 7 de la mañana, para las 6 de la tarde empiezo a trabajar.
Okay, ¿me das un momentito, Santos? Okay, so this is Santos, and he arrived 26 years ago. And he's been working with the Garment Working Center for 3 years. When he arrived, he wasn't knowledgeable about working with garments. And he's been working right now, attaching labels, and he gets paid about 5 cents per label. And he starts working He starts working from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. and he makes around $200 a week.
Yeah, and just before we move on, I'd love to hear kind of what the conditions in the various factories that he's worked at are like, and particularly during COVID, when when people when garment workers were continuing to go into factories because they were considered essential workers.
Okay, let me ask. Santo. Sí, le quieren preguntar cómo eran las condiciones de trabajo en las que trabajaba y sobre todo durante COVID, cómo estaban cómo estaba la situación durante ese momento.
Al principio trabajamos ahí como cerca de unos 35 personas, pero no hay espacio como cuando estamos trabajando ahí y cuando llegó esta enfermedad de la pandemia. Y seguimos así trabajando porque y cuando empezamos a trabajar ahí, siempre estamos una cerca del otro y ahí trabajos por gusto nos entregan, ahí siempre trabajamos así. Y no hay espacio. Y cuando nosotros le dijimos al patrón que nos abra el espacio porque como hace calor y no podía en esa oportunidad. Y eso es donde nos afectamos nosotros ahí salimos como 5 personas afectadas ahí del coronavirus.
¿Y estas personas se curaron?
Sí, se curaron. Pero hace poco que escuché que hay uno que se murió ahí. Sí, ya no aguantó más y falleció en ese mismo trabajo.
Okay, gracias. Santos says that the working conditions were deplorable. There were like 35 people working. There's truly no space between them. They were always together, so there was no way to be separated one from each other, like normal the COVID rules. 5 people got sick and 1 perished from those 35 working in that situation.
Yeah, and I think it was kind of a story that didn't get told. We in the newspapers we heard a lot about meat packing plants and other places where there was a lot of death because of essential workers continuing to go to work, and we just didn't hear about this. So moving on a little bit to sort of the policy, and I'd love to come back to this issue of the working conditions during COVID, but President Biden has expressed an interest in local manufacturing because, of course, as the senator mentioned, this is a huge source of revenue, right? For the and it's a huge it's a huge part of the American economy, right? And so given the interest in local manufacturing, is there a way for us to leverage this interest from the current administration into supporting the rights of workers? So I'd love to talk to all my panelists about this. Maybe Senator, you can start, but then I would love to bring in Sarah and Marissa as well into this part of the conversation.
Well, I think Ayesha and Marissa could really talk about it, but I think we're kind of smiling because this last week, Ayesha and several other business owners participated in a business roundtable with others, the California Chamber of Commerce and the California retailers and a few others, and just kind of in a very extremely smart, high road way responded to that question, especially as it was asked in a way that nobody should support this bill because it's going to hurt the industry. And so I would defer to Ayesha to answer that question. She was pretty remarkable.
Ayesha, please jump in.
Thank you so very much, Senator. And, Elizabeth, I will say that given the scandals that we've seen in Leicester, UK, with Boohoo, given the issues that we're seeing in Los Angeles, one thing that has become very clear is that this is less about which country you're operating in and more about the fundamental business model of these fashion brands, the prices that they pay, the business models that they set up, which perpetuates the sweatshop conditions and a lot of the issues that we're seeing. So I think first and foremost, it really is about the business model. And then, in terms of sort of what we're seeing in LA and is this an opportunity, I'd say absolutely. Within Remake, we have a seal of approval where at this point we have over 176 sustainable brands that are really here in many ways as the future of the industry, representing a very different type of fashion industry. And a lot of the ones who do produce in LA are here very supportive of the bill, because part of what they tell us is currently the playing field is not level. And for those of us that are paying the $15 minimum wage and are doing right by our garment makers, the predatory brands get away with it. And so the competition is simply not fair. So from a business imperative standpoint, if we want sustainable, ethical manufacturing and sustainable brands to thrive in LA, then we have to close out these loopholes and clean this up. Now, I think COVID has also taught us that there has been a lot of ruptures, as we've seen in the supply chain. Supply chains aren't as resilient as we had thought. And so certainly one of the other things we've been hearing from our sustainable brand partners is that the demand in LA is absolutely going up. There are more and more companies that are interested in nearshoring. Right now in Cambodia and India, there are COVID rates spiking, with it becoming impossible to get product here. With the CBP holding product that's coming from the Uyghur region in China, there are again disruptions, and every fashion brand is implicated when it comes to the Uyghur region. So that's something else that brands are contending with. And then within Myanmar, with the military coup and essentially it becoming impossible to do business here, what you're starting to see is, because of all of these forces that play in COVID having really exasperated that nearshoring interest has gone up. That, as well as the bold agenda that the Biden administration has set around climate and wanting to make sure that businesses are paying their fair share when it comes to taxation, I do think we have this perfect moment in time where the Garment Worker Protection Act is set up to really level the playing field and capture this interest in nearshoring in the United States to make it a sustainable fashion hub rather than a race to the bottom.
Yeah, Sarah, would you talk a little bit about what we could, how we can sort of put pressure on the Biden administration to take something like the Garment Worker Protection Act seriously and lobby, on behalf of such legislation and support it and put his weight behind it?
Well, that might be a question for you guys there on the ground. Even though I'm American, I've been on the ground there for a while. So I'll pass it over to you guys who are doing the organizing on the ground there. But just to echo what Ayesha said, I mean, I definitely think there's lessons to be learned and mostly avoided from the example of, the increase in nearshoring in the UK, as Ayesha said. Just the other week, actually, there was another reported allegation of a brand who actually kind of marketed themselves as ethical and sustainable as having terrible conditions and a lack of social distancing and proper PPE in a factory here in London. And then, of course, Ayesha is absolutely right in talking about the fact that this is not any one country. This is really about the brand's business models driving down the prices, even often not even acting legally. So there definitely any legislation we should be looking at moving forward in the US context should really be ensuring that there's, complaint mechanisms in place so that workers and who are working in some of these factories where the simple law isn't even being obeyed has the chance to speak up and then investigations can take place, and then remedy can come as a result of that. So, but in terms of putting pressure on the Biden administration, I think I would pass that over to the Garment Workers Center, who's been doing all the organizing on the ground there.
Yeah, Marissa, I'd love to hear from you about this. I mean, I know that you've been lobbying for this, and you've been sort of fighting for it on the ground. What are the obstacles that you're facing, and how hard has it been to get, you know, the Biden administration and people at the federal level to pay attention to something like this?
Yeah. Well, you know, I guess first I want to respond to why it's important to leverage, you know, Biden's interest in domestic manufacturing. You know, we're very, we're Los Angeles based, and we very much focus, you know, what is happening on the ground here, but we also really believe that what workers are doing here and how they're organizing can serve as a model for what other states will do in their labor codes for workers, and can serve as a model for what, you know, federal labor law looks at and considers. We've seen that that's possible with strong organizing when we think about the Fight for 15 campaigns that began in little cities and towns across the country and really got elevated to a national level. Again, that just shows the power of organizing. And what I want to say is that, you know, I absolutely agree that, you know, of course, you know, I think it's important for us to think about domestic manufacturing because we have the workforce and we have the infrastructure here, but it as Ayesha said, it doesn't matter where where the production happens. It won't change the industry in of itself. You know, just manufacturing domestically will not change the industry. What we have to be pushing for is that, you know, often when advocates and government talks of, domestic manufacturing, they talk of economic recovery or quote unquote thriving economies. But the reality is that almost as a rule does not include the workers who are the backbone of that economy and those industries. So how we can leverage that, I think, as on the ground, as organizations, as advocates, as legislators, is to say, if this is a priority for our federal administration, it has to really look at what workers have been pushing for across the country in terms of, centering their rights. We cannot have any sort of economic recovery or any rebuilding of domestic manufacturing and on the status quo. The status quo is exploitative. The status quo is a sweatshop. The status quo is sub-minimum wages that keep people in absolute poverty. We cannot rebuild anything that way. Rebuilding for who, would be the question. So I do think that any interest in domestic manufacturing opens the opportunity for folks that are on the ground, for folks that are doing the organizing to say, okay, you want to talk about industry, you want to talk about manufacturers, let's talk about the workers. And let's talk about the businesses that are trying to do the right thing. They're here struggling to compete with these sweatshops. Let's talk about how to center the workers, and let's talk about how to center those types of businesses. Only then will we have any sort of real recovery in our domestic manufacturing sector.
And I think in some ways, Elizabeth, it's like can California be out in the front as we often have with our pioneering spirit? It just makes sense for us to get it right in California because the biggest manufacturing hub is right here in Los Angeles. It's where we have the manufacturing power, but we also have an ecosystem, right? We've got the creative industry, we've got more manufacturing power, we've got mills. And so if we were to get it right in California, perhaps New York would take note. And so I think part of this is it's very smart for us to be thinking about it at a state by state level. Yet at the same time, when you called for a fashion czar through your open letter to the Biden administration, we were very happy to sign on along with, was it some 80, 90 other businesses? Because, when it comes to the industry, the fashion industry in particular, here's an industry worth $2.6 trillion that's mostly deregulated. And if you look at any other industry, you really, any of the climate targets, all voluntary, all the human rights abuses so pervasive, everything is voluntary. And so I think elevating the conversation to match the Biden administration's goals, while at the same time pushing for smart policy where the essential workers live, is the right type of play. But I think one thing is very clear. 30 years of voluntary efforts have simply gotten us not far enough. And it really is time for us to assure that regulation is passed, because otherwise, the industry guarding itself has brought us back to here we are in sweatshop conditions, by the way, with workers fighting for their lives and livelihood during the pandemic.
Elizabeth, I could just say a quick word. I think with regards to the Biden administration, one other issue that has to be raised to them is that this is an industry of women, and we cannot allow an industry that's so important for the world, the fashion industry, to let women be treated that way. This is an overwhelming at all levels. Well, almost at all levels, not, so I think that's a really important way to describe. Here, the Legislative Women's Caucus adopted as a priority piece of legislation, right, to raise the issues of women like garment workers. I think the other is to mix up the voices. The fact that Ayesha and all the business, small business owners and professionals in this industry are speaking up is really different from being able to ignore, immigrant women because they're poor, because many of them are undocumented. So you could shove them aside, some of them think that way. But when you get the mix of business owners and professionals and others in this industry, it makes a difference. So I think that's why what you're doing today, will add to that. And this business roundtable, there's no doubt that all of the arguments, from the moral to the economic, you name it, these business owners like Ayesha held their ground and were just so much better at answering the questions and putting forth the arguments. And finally, Elizabeth, I need to jump off and get to another issue here, but I want to thank you all very, very much for raising this beyond Los Angeles, the country and the world. Really appreciate you.
We all are so grateful to you for sharing your time with us today and for your insight and for this bill, which we're going to fight like hell for. So thank you so much.
Que viva la mujer. Gracias.
Thank you so much. Ayesha, you brought up the fashion czar idea. I'm just going to provide a little bit of context for people who don't know about it. But several months ago, when we at Fast Company, my magazine, were thinking about the first 100 days of the Biden administration, we were basically coming up with our wish list of a policy agenda. And as a fashion writer, I thought, what we really need is a fashion czar. And what I was thinking is just that, during moments of crisis, American presidents have appointed these individuals who, we call czars, who manage a crisis, and they manage it across multiple fronts. And the concept for me was that, the fashion industry, for anybody who is in this industry or who knows anything about it, it is causing, and it is in the midst of a massive crisis, right? It is perpetuating a lot of harms to humans as well as to the environment. And we need to fix these things really quickly, right? And the government needs to be involved, and it needs to be involved across multiple fronts. So, it needs to be, happening in terms of thinking about environmental regulations, but also workers' protections. Now, it's really interesting because to me, it just seemed like such an obvious concept. And I think given the interest from the fashion community, many other people thought, yeah, this is just a no-brainer. But what I would love to ask you is why is it so why has the fashion industry been so off the radar, right, for the federal government, while the oil industry, the auto industry, these other industries are industries that the government is paying very close attention to and regulating. Fashion industry is not regulating, is not regulated in the same way. And so I would just love to hear your thoughts. I mean, personally, I'm very interested in why this is. Ayesha, do you want to jump in on that one? And then I'd love to hear from Marissa as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think partly it's the nature of the fashion industry, right? Once MFA, the multi-fiber arrangement expired, we essentially moved all production overseas, something like 97, 98% of it. And most fashion brands and retailers, I think people don't realize this, are essentially just glorified marketeers, right? At this point, beyond just setting the conception and design and the production that we have in Los Angeles, a lot of that manufacturing capability, and frankly, a lot of the headaches of the human rights abuses and environmental impacts, we just shipped overseas. So part of this was, well, not in my backyard. The other thing I'd say is, as really coming closer to my activist roots by working with the incredible Marissa and being behind the scene with the Garment Worker Protection Act, you start to realize how much lobbying power business has and how essentially it's sort of hiding behind the chambers of commerce. But really it just becomes this tagline that anything to do with environmental protections or labor protections is automatically equated to being a job killer, rather than recognizing that if we were to treat people as assets rather than cost centers and truly invest in fashion's most essential workers, because these are high-skilled workers, we would be a thriving industry. So I think it was a perfect storm of essentially outsourcing most of our production manufacturing muscle and really business having so much say in our politics. But Marissa, I'm sure you have a lot more to
It's so interesting because, the fashion industry is a global system and all the parts are connected, but it seems like governments are only paying attention to, the part that is in their country, right? And so in this country, we're consumers, right? We're buying these products. We have a lot of fashion brands that are here. And so the government's not paying attention to the manufacturing, part of which is happening here, but a lot of it is happening overseas. But we are part of that. We are perpetuating those abuses that are happening elsewhere. Marissa, I'd love to hear your thoughts about, why this industry gets so overlooked. I'm sure it's super frustrating to you as you're fighting for it every day.
Sure. No, of course it does. I guess I'll start by saying I really agree with what Ayesha said. I think that we've seen in other industries, even that are recognized, when we have these czars or these, this attention. But again, when we talk about sort of, prioritizing or focusing on an industry, it's often with a corporate focus, and often with the mentality, the mindset that it's enough to create the jobs, whatever the job is, however, even if it's not really serving working people. And so, I think I'm very interested in the concept of a fashion czar. Again, but it has to be informed and by working people's needs. I think we're lucky in the we have some opportunity to really bring some amazing expertise at the federal level with the nomination of Julie Su for Deputy Secretary. It's a brilliant nomination, very astute nomination, and we're very hopeful. Julie Su was our labor secretary in California, and and also has a very grounded history in the garment industry in California, and helped write the original Garment Worker Protection Act that really was landmark, groundbreaking legislation that slowly got kind of like misinterpreted and kind of poked at to create a major loophole that we're dealing with in SB 62. But I just wanted to say that, when you get, just really grounded expertise in these positions, absolutely, there can be a difference made, I think, and I just want to just add another layer to, why I think this industry is overlooked. It's absolutely the corporate interests. This is multi-billion-dollar industry. you know, ignoring the labor issues and ignoring the true costs of labor then, you know, generates more profits, of course. But I think we also have to remember who are the workers around the world, including in the US and around the world. The workers are people of color and they're women. And so, you know, this is racialized capitalism just gone wild around the world. And, you know, we know that the needs and the well-being of people of color, of migrants, of women in our countries, very much especially undocumented individuals, are very much subjugated and ignored and dismissed. So, you know, I think that is another reason. So if you add, as Ayesha said, that sort of perfect storm of like rampant corporate power and this notion that maybe there's no longer any real industry in the US, which is not true, though a lot has gone offshore. We have tens of thousands of garment workers just in Los Angeles, right? Over 45,000 garment workers that deserve as much industry.
Yeah. And I also think that, I mean, so there's the racialized aspect of it, and then there's sex, and, you know, so basically levels of marginalization. So this community of workers doesn't feel empowered to speak, and for a good reason. I mean, there's a lot of harassment, and there's a lot of ways that they can be oppressed if they speak out. I also think, you know, Sarah, you mentioned this in a comment just a second ago. I also think that there's another way that gender plays into this, in that, you know, the fashion industry continues to be thought of as this kind of feminized, you know, frivolous industry, right? It's for, you know, it's for influencers, people who spend a lot of time on Instagram, who really care a lot about fashion and clothes, and as a result, you know, this thriving, important part of the global economy and the American economy, it doesn't get the same weight as you know, the auto industry, right? Which is ridiculous, because you know, their lives at stake, and the planet is at stake here. Sarah, would you tell us a little bit about what you mean by this frivolity that people assume is part of the fashion industry?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, this is certainly something I've come across a lot when meeting with politicians who don't necessarily work on these issues, is they're just sometimes quite perplexed about talking about fashion, because they just think it is a frivolous sector. And that's the case, I think, with a lot of creative sectors. It's just not taken seriously like other, you know, big influential sectors are, like obviously oil and gas and, you know, manufacturing, which, you know, play such an important role in the like historical narrative of industrialization in our countries. And I think also because throughout most of history, you know, as Marissa talked about, it has been seen as not just women's work, but an industry mostly for women, and about women, and therefore largely gets ignored or viewed as, you know, kind of this frivolous industry that's kind of on the periphery, when it's obviously a massive commercial powerhouse and employs, you know, millions and millions of people throughout the world, as you said, who are mostly, you know, young women of color.
And I also think that it says a lot about who is in power, right? And I think, Ayesha, you mentioned this in the comments, which is that, you know, well, first of all, you know, who's running the government, right? Like, who are these elected officials? They're people who may not be paying attention to this industry because they're not necessarily consumers, right? Like the fashion industry still primarily targets women as consumers. We're still the dominant consumer. And so, you know, just having more diversity in government, you know, may have an impact on just like raising awareness about this. But yeah, I just want to move on very finally before we get to the Q&A. So if anybody here in the audience has questions, please begin putting them into the chat, and I am looking forward to asking our wonderful panelists. But before, you know, we close out this session, I would love to hear what a renewed and ethical American fashion industry would look like. So I know this is something that we're all fighting for. I would love to just sort of think through what it would be like. So obviously we're fighting for fair wages, and that will be part of it. But what does this industry, look like to all of you? And actually, I would like to ask this of Santo, if he's willing to share about it. Like, what is, given what he sees as all of the problems in his workplace now, what would a better workplace look like for him? Like, how does he feel about about what could change to make working better for him?
Santo. ¿Sí me escucha?
Sí.
Sí, le quieren preguntar, ¿qué sería para usted un mejor lugar de trabajo? Sobre todo ahora con lo que está pasando de COVID y con las nuevas leyes que ojalá que se puedan implementar. ¿Qué sería para usted un mejor lugar de trabajo?
El mejor lugar es ¿cómo se llama cuando uno empieza a trabajar?
Disculpa, Santos, no te oigo bien. Si me puedes hablar más claro.
El mejor, que nos pagan bien y que tenemos comunidad ahí, porque a veces se exploten ahí en donde trabajamos, a veces se explota mucha gente ahí. Ese es el problema ahí donde estamos. Hemos aguantado durante los 26 años, hemos aguantado muchas discriminación de parte de los dueños.
Okay, gracias, Santos. Santos says that what he's looking forward is that he gets living wage, minimum salary, that they get treated fairly, and that they work in a community, that they get what they actually deserve as the garment workers.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and thank you so much, Santo. We appreciate your insights. Yeah, talk me through what this new world that we're trying to create will look like. I'll let Ayesha jump in here.
So, Elizabeth, in the heydays of Pay Up, when we were essentially just trying to, I think, in some ways, just stop the bleed, right, of workers around the world reporting hunger, not being paid their wages, protesting for severance up against police brutality, we came together as a coalition along with Garment Workers Center. I know Fashion Revolution is a proud supporter of our 7 action points. It's essentially a worker-centered manifesto of what should the future of fashion look like. So for those interested, it's payupfashion.com, and we essentially ordered, what that future would look like in terms of near-term emergency, what we need, and in the longer term. And I'd say, right now, we should be very clear, even as we're trying to dream big, that the largest humanitarian crisis for garment makers here in LA and globally is happening right now. And so we need to keep our eye on the prize in terms of holding industry accountable. There are still many brands that have not paid up. With all of the ruptures that are happening with COVID and product being unable to be shipped from places, as I mentioned, in Cambodia and India, there are manufacturers literally begging for their contracts to be paid. So hunger, making sure that women are safe, the rise in gender-based violence. What we're needing, I'd say, in the near term is making sure that direct relief gets to workers worldwide. The international financial institutions have failed miserably in that regard. No fashion brand is committed to anything in terms of relief in a substantive manner. So before we go dream big, let's just also focus on what needs to happen. And as I look to the future, really, the Garment Worker Protection Act is what I think the future should be. Worker-authored legislation that puts people as assets in the center of this industry, the very people who have kept this industry profitable forever. And if we were to dream in LA, we've got creative talent. We've got some amazing ethical businesses who are supportive of this bill. We've got talent. We can nearshore and be thinking about environmental impacts in a fundamentally different way. San Francisco is a stone throw away where all the lab technology around circularity is happening. So we could be this perfect bubble, if I were to dream big, around being the sustainable capital of the world. But first we have to get this bill passed.
For sure. So I'm going to ask Sarah, and then I'm going to let Marissa close it out, and then I'm going to go to a Q&A. But Sarah, what's on your wish list for recreating the fashion system here in the United
Well,
States?
yeah, I guess if we dream, well, I'll talk about maybe slightly the maybe some of the dream big stuff. Since Ayesha talked about the urgent things that need to be tackled right now, which are so crucial and important. But I think, you know, definitely on my wish is we need it definitely an overhaul, complete overhaul of how corporate behavior is allowed to get away with what it gets away with. And I think, you know, part of that is really is a couple of things. It's like, is creating legislation that ensures that companies can no longer turn a blind eye. It's creating legislations that ensure that they can no longer get away with the purchasing practices of which they, you know, pull the strings of. Really, really regulating the way that they behave. And that includes ending shareholder primacy. So ensuring that the planet and the people who are working the length of the value chain are, you know, are part of really, you know, how business is valued and how business is done, and making directors liable for that. So that would really be, I think, quite high up on my wish list. And some of these conversations and some of these potential pieces of legislation are potentially going to be tabled in the near future in the EU. So I think that's some legislation that maybe we can look to as models for other countries.
And Marissa, just tell us very finally what's on your wish list here.
Oh my goodness, so many things. But I will say this, you know, I often think about what's on my dream list. I think of it as sort of this kind of spokes on a wheel. You know, there's no one solution to what is a very big problem, right? But I think, you know, we tend to think of it in terms of you have to have really strong, sound, balanced, you know, regulation and labor standards in place and strong, robust enforcement of those labor standards. Otherwise, the law doesn't matter if it's not enforced. It's just words on a piece of paper. Strong labor laws, strong enforcement. But you also have to have all actors being held accountable in the system, right? If there are major actors that are not held accountable in that system, you have a gaping hole and that law is weakened. Those regulations and standards are weakened. So you want to see that. You want to see really sound, you know, monitoring of the supply chain, required monitoring of the supply chain, where workers have true access and engagement to be able to inform those audits and be the eyes and ears and say what is going on in the ground in that supply chain. And I also think that we have to have a very, you know, the rights and things that we have really are only strong if we're exercising them, right? So having a really educated, engaged, active base of workers who are ready to engage in collective action to assert those rights and have the right to organize beyond those rights, because why shouldn't we have more than the bare minimum, right? That has to happen to have, you know, to have a real industry that thrives for everybody. And then finally, I think I would say that, you know, we also have to change the culture and narratives that exist in this industry. We have to normalize that paying the true cost of labor is absolutely required and essential and is possible without everything falling apart, as the businesses and corporations like to say. No, it can happen. The corporations can absolutely make a choice not to pass all of those costs onto their consumers. The major fashion brands, they can take that, they can make the choice to pay for the true cost of labor and absorb that into their business model and still make a handsome profit. And it's important for consumers to demand that, for all of us to demand that. I guess those are sort of the kind of specific things I see. And then I guess I want to say that, to echo what Santos said, it's about, what I think why we at Garment Workers Center participate in this work and organize in this industry is because workers say that we just want a place that treats us fairly, a place that treats us as, with some dignity and pays us what we deserve, where there's not discrimination against us. And I think that's so, that's not, those are not just sort of pretty words. That's central. That's essential. When you think about why it's important to organize around wage theft and labor abuse, because it's not just what happens in that factory, but the ripple effect. What happens to the person when their dignity is not respected, when their rights are not respected? What happens to the household, the family, the overall community when a person's labor and skill are essentially robbed from them? And what can happen if the opposite is true? If a person's craft and skill and what they're giving out to the world is properly compensated, is properly respected, and the ripple effects that has in the individual and the family and the household. That's why we organize for this, because that's the kind of world that we have. No one should be giving away their labor and their creativity and their skill to only serve the needs of somebody who's not interested in their needs. No, we want to see reciprocity in every industry where workers are giving away their labor, and that's what we're fighting for in the garment industry.
And I think from my perspective as a fashion writer and thinking about brands and consumers, my wish is that consumers will just be buying less, right, and be paying for quality items, right? Because I think that part of how we got here is because the fast fashion industry normalized creating disposable clothes at the expense of of human life, right, on the labor of workers that we then take and wear literally 7 times, right, I think is an estimate, and then we throw it away, creating waste for the planet. It's all intertwined, right? And I think one good thing that I'm seeing is that there's kind of a move now towards pushing back against this overconsumption and buying more durable clothes, which I think, and paying more for those durable clothes, which I think can have a ripple effect throughout the system. So I think we're all connected here. All of us are part of this big puzzle. So now I have some really interesting questions here from the audience, and so I'm gonna pose it to my wonderful panelists. I think one interesting question is, there's somebody who's asking from the perspective of a brand. So she's launched a small brand in San Francisco, and so how does somebody like that start a conversation with the factory about the hourly pay versus the piece rate? That's a real tactical question. So for brands, right, who are part of this very complex supply chain, how do we empower the brands to put pressure on factories to treat their workers better? I'm going to start with you, Ayesha, because I think you've started to answer that question.
Marissa, I'm sure you'd have something to add to that, but I'd say one very easy way, as wonderful brand here in San Francisco, is endorse SB 62 and then say, I really do support hourly wages. I think it's important to recognize that the bill doesn't eliminate piece rate, right? What the bill says is that the floor is what you have to do, which is that the minimum wage is what you pay. And then if you want productivity incentive targets to sit on top of that, you can certainly use piece rate to do that. So I think that's important, because sometimes factories will worry about, well, with piece rate, I have productivity, and if piece rate completely goes away, do I lose some of those productivity incentives? So I think having sort of a nuanced conversation on it's not one or the other, we're simply saying, that the hourly wage should be the baseline, is a way to essentially push back on some of what we've heard from some manufacturing partners as fear, which is really not in the bill. And I'd say really coming at this as a partnership, right? I think the person asking the question said, I'm quite small. And to know that, a lot of the business leaders who are supportive of this bill are exactly that, right? A new generation of smaller, sustainable businesses. And for factories to know that you're coming at this as a partner, but also, frankly, are you paying the prices for them to do what's right? I think this is where language becomes really important, Elizabeth. For too long, we've been talking about force the factories to do the right thing, whereas a lot of brands will pay the types of prices which essentially perpetuate the wage theft. So if you're coming in partnership and collaboration to have the conversation to say, open costing, this is what I'm able to pay, does that allow you to pay the hourly wage? Then therein is a partnership rather than pushing the risk on to your manufacturer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Marissa, I would love to hear your perspective, like just from like a tactical level on the ground. Like how does a brand advocate for for better conditions in the factories that they're working with?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think, Ayesha, you covered it really well. What we've learned, I'll say from the start, we're a worker rights, organization. So that's our expertise, right? But in the last 2.5 years, we've really invested a lot of resources in networking and really getting to know LA's fashion business that has, ethical fashion business, and talking to them and asking these questions and hearing their responses. And what we've learned from the fashion brands that are trying to really do the right thing here is just that they say, I have to be engaged. Right? I have to, where do I want to produce? Visit those factories, right? Know your supply chain, because many fashion brands certainly take the position that, I don't have to be involved in that. Or maybe I only have to send like quality control, but I don't have to be involved in any other sort of controls or standards. But visit your factories, really know your supply chains, find your mechanisms, and ask your manufacturers and contractors to be able to have access to the workers and talk to the workers, hear from the workers. Also, I think it's important to know the power that you have as a fashion brand and to use that as a good platform, right? And so, as Ayesha said, it's about a partnership. If you find that maybe things are concerning for you, how can you, work with that factory? Is there a way that you can invest in your suppliers to, make sure that there's proper training, that there's proper, investment and the funds for, really making sure that everything is up to par and everything is up to code? You should be investing in that and working in partnership with your suppliers. What we don't encourage is, just outright cutting ties with a factory. I can understand that may, seem like the right thing to do. Let me just cut ties. This is there's problems here and I don't want to, be associated with that. That results in job loss immediately almost to workers. That means they don't get their final wages. They don't know what's going to happen next. If a small supplier loses major contracts, all of a sudden, it's the workers that suffer the most. Now, you may find that there are suppliers that they just refuse to do the right thing, and you're going to have to make those choices. But we're really learning from some of our partners and this network that we've created, that when you work in that partnership, when you talk to your suppliers and find the solutions together for making sure that everything is up to code and standards, that, that's where you really have sort of that kind of synergy for like having a good ethical supply chain. And yes, I absolutely think that, what we hear from our partners is it's that much harder to do the right thing when they're competing in an unlevel playing field. We're not saying that these things are easy. What we are saying is we do think that there are solutions there. And one of the first solutions is that everybody along the supply chain is held accountable. It shouldn't fall heavily on one actor or the other. And that's why we're asking for brand accountability through SB 62. And I'll just say one other thing, what we've also learned through Department of Labor investigations is that what a brand pays for its garment orders has so much to bear on what a worker, the actual worker that assembles that garment, is paid. There are time studies that the Department of Labor does to assess, is that enough? Is that enough to allow that supplier to comply with minimum wage and overtime? But there's simply not enough government resources to do that for every single shop out there. But if brands are taking that initiative and again investing in their supply chain to ensure that they're actually enabling compliance with labor standards, that's really sweeping change in this industry. And so you have that power to do that. And GWC, and I'm sure Remake, is also happy to talk with folks further about SB 62, about what we've learned, in this network and how to support good, ethical fashion business. So please reach out.
And information for the various people on this panel was dropped in the chat. And so if you have very specific questions or would like to collaborate with others on this panel, please feel free to reach out. So Sarah, earlier in the conversation, you mentioned something about poor working conditions in London. And I think Ayesha was also talking about Boohoo, and I think it was related to this. But yeah, so I think, maybe if you could share a little bit more about, I guess we can take this a little bit more broadly, but like basically, what the conditions were like in London and maybe even here during the pandemic for people who were not were not aware.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it was very similar, kind of things going on in LA as there was in Leicester and in London as well. Most kind of factory workers in the UK were seen as essential workers as well, just like they were in LA. A lot of the retail shops were closed, but of course the online ultra fast fashion brands like Boohoo were still, and Fashion Nova and similar sorts of brands were still very much in operation, and their profits were still, growing and growing, and producing, 1,000 styles a week, which means, very fast lead times and big orders still needing to be, made, and the nearshoring model for them really supported that, and that meant production was continuing to happen as usual in Leicester and London, and in Leicester in particular, there's so many of the same kind of parallel issues going on as there is in LA. There's a lot of immigrant workers working in Leicester, mainly from Southeast Asia, who are often brought over on slightly dubious terms, promised visas, and then end up getting paid at less than the minimum wage through lots of different loopholes, and brands turning a blind eye. Meanwhile, the way that production lines are set up in a lot of these facilities doesn't really allow for social distancing, and again, like not same thing, not having soap, not having proper PPE. These are all the kinds of things that have been going on in Leicester, and that groups like Labor Behind the Label here in the UK did a lot of great work to uncover and bring to light, and thankfully the government really took that seriously. And started investigating exactly what's going on there. Now a lot of focus is being put on it, a lot of action is being taken, but we'll have to see what the result is of that. I don't think that Boohoo's bottom line has been impacted in any way. If anything, their profits have only grown, unfortunately, quarter on quarter. But hopefully at the moment we have a conservative government, and who I feel a bit skeptical about, but hopefully they will take some sort of action against these sort of practices. We'll see.
The one thing I will say, Elizabeth, on the Boohoo case and why it's different from the Garment Worker Protection Act is that even though in the UK you've got a trade adjudicator and you've got a way to have parliamentary inquiry when you've got these sweatshop-like conditions, there is no enforcement, there's no teeth. And so Leicester as sort of a sweatshop environment has been an open secret for a really long time. And even though there can be complaints and it becomes a media circus, nothing actually happens in terms of cleaning up the conditions. What's different with the Garment Worker Protection Act is this multilateral accountability, which would essentially, again, goes back to the brands and their business model. I think the other very interesting thing about what's happening in Leicester is, as I said, that CBP, the Border Patrol here in the United States, is now investigating not just Boohoo, but the entire city of Leicester around these conditions, because legally you're not allowed to bring product into the US that's made by modern day slavery. So that's very interesting, because all of a sudden then, it's like, you want to get your product here? Well, maybe you'll have to clean it up. So I think it's just for companies to take notice that we may have patchwork ways of holding them accountable, but ultimately it really does come down to needing enforcement and liability. Otherwise, it just becomes a lot of circus and nothing gets better.
Yeah, for sure. For this final question, it's basically, what's next in terms of legislation. So I think I'd like to break that into two parts. So first of all, just, SB 62. So what's next? What's happening with that law, and what do we need to have it, go over the finish line? And then I guess more broadly, in terms of once, we're dealing with this particular legislation, what's in the pipeline? What other laws, are you thinking about that could make working conditions better for workers? I think, Marissa, you're the best person to sort of to answer this particular one. So take it away.
I can certainly start on SB 62. Yeah, we, I appreciate the question. We are sort of still kind of early in our campaign for this year. It's a statewide bill campaign, and that means we have to get through two state houses, the Senate and the Assembly, and we're currently in the Senate. In each house, there are 4 hearings that our bill goes through, and they'll be voted, the bill will be voted on. And every hearing, every vote really gives supporters the opportunity to weigh in, the opportunity to really help get the votes that we need to keep this bill moving. So we, right now we're in a bit of a small kind of pause before our next hearing that we anticipate will probably be, it will either be late April or early May. And the way to stay in touch with that is to stay on our social media platforms. Every hearing, we have action alerts. You can go, there and see, what we're asking our supporters to do. Our allies and supporters and all of our members, they're making, we have call-in days. They're calling their electeds and saying, we want this bill to pass. They're joining legislative sessions. If you're a close ally and really, really committed on this, it's really exciting to sit in those meetings together, workers, advocates, and local business. I mean, it's just like a really strong front. And, so I think there's a lot of really exciting things to get involved in. And so, we're hoping and very confident that we're going to get through both houses with all the support that we've been able to garner. And come fall, once that happens, then we move to the governor's desk, and the governor decides, does he approve or veto? So we still have a long way to go in this year, but it's very kind of fast moving and dynamic. And again, there's all these opportunities to really jump in. You can sign a petition, you can send letters, you can get on a call, as things loosen up and there's more and more safety, we'll have actions that can, in-person actions. We had our first very small socially distanced one recently, and we look forward to doing more and more of that. So that's where we're going with that piece of legislation. Again, we have so much support and it's growing that we feel very confident, but that doesn't mean we let up. We have to just keep fighting and keep up the momentum. And I really can't emphasize enough that when electeds, when our legislators are hearing from the public, when they're hearing from local business, when they're hearing from, you know, consumers, when they're hearing from workers, they're really paying attention to that. It's very noticeable when there's a line of calls that are during public testimony for a hearing in support of our bill. I mean, it's really like impactful to hear that. So I'm hoping to animate you that you can really, really have a very direct impact on this bill. What does the future hold after that? You know, there's going to be more to do. First, when we get this bill passed, we have to make sure it's enforced, as Ayesha was just uplifting. You know, laws are nothing without strong enforcement. We have to make sure that there's good, strong implementation, regulations, and enforcement. And I think, you know, we're not waiting for this, but I think, you know, already within sort of the network of local business, I think we really have to, there's a lot of conversation about like, how does this industry continue to, you know, how does it recover from the pandemic, and how does it continue to grow and thrive, and how can we do that in a very different way than has been the status quo? And I think that there can be some interesting policy models that can come out of that conversation, both of like, how do we support workers and how do we support these businesses? What incentives can be created so that this, you know, as exists in other industries, so that this industry can continue to grow. So that's sort of where our mind is, yeah.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end, because it puts some of the onus on all of us who are here and paying attention and who care about this issue. We have a voice here in this conversation too. There are things that we can do. There's pressure we can put on our elected officials. And so please go and follow the Garment Workers Center on its various social media platforms. And just make your voices heard, because that's how we create action. And I think what's really exciting is that, you know, if this passes and if there's media attention put on this particular bill, you know, there's a chance for, you know, broader change in this country, right? There's a ripple effect that could happen. And so we can be part of that, right? And so that's really exciting. So thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you for being part of this panel and sharing your amazing insights. So thank you so much. And for those of you who are at home, I hope you feel empowered to join in this fight. So thank you so much. Gracias.
Thank you. Before we close out, I'm just going to thank everyone for coming. And just plug, we have so many more events coming up for Fashion Revolution Week. Please stay involved, please ask questions, and please attend other events and find ways to stay connected. Thank you to our speakers, and Santos, gracias, thank you for coming, and have a lovely rest of